I've had a lifetime of interviewing politicians, but the one politician I would really have loved to talk to was, of course, one that's almost 200 years dead. And the reason that I would have wanted to talk to Daniel O'Connell is he's the greatest politician that we ever had. He was the first one to really understand the power of popular politics, bringing everybody together. That was an incredible power. So he took politics out of the hands of the old ascendancy, which is where it was, really. And the wonderful thing about the way that he did it was that he did it without shedding a drop of blood. That was the very nature of his politics anyway. This was democratic politics. It would operate through Parliament. It involved everybody, no matter who or how powerful she or he was. So that's the politician that I always wanted to talk to, the man who had it all in his head. And it would be a dreadful shame if we forgot that the liberties we now have and the system which allows us to have the sort of peaceful politics that we do have, for all its faults, that system was really brought into being by Daniel O'Connell. There's been a widespread view, you know, that O'Connell is passé, a Catholic liberator in a post-Catholic Ireland. Yet this is the man who fought for civil and religious rights for all, for separation of church and state, for peaceful protest. As he stands there in the street where we commemorate our violent uprisings, you have to ask why we don't have a day commemorating him. A day for the man who said, "Not for all the universe contains would I, in the struggle for what I conceive my country's cause, consent to the effusion of a single drop of blood except my own." Is it because of that very moral stance that Daniel O'Connell is often consigned to the dustier shelves of Irish history? Because he stands as a reproach to all our bloody rebellions.
I don't think that he stands as a reproach. I do think that he stands as the countercultural voice which ultimately triumphs. Why? Because I believe that in the end, his view of how we give expression to the rights of people, how we become egalitarian, how we become democratized, I believe that that has been ultimately vindicated. It took a long time to vindicate it.
It did.
In our own case, and again, a lot of dead bodies and a lot of hurt people on the way. I've often thought, I think I've often said, that the Good Friday Agreement is actually, it's O'Connell's agreement, because he wanted, in the end of the day, a reconciliation between those who believed in the use of violence and those who believed in the use of the democratic impulse and the powers of persuasion. And at the end of the day, when I look at O'Connell, I don't just see the towering Irish politician. I see the towering international politician, the man whose support for other causes around the world speaks to me of someone who had this really extraordinarily transcendent view, way above the politics of the moment. There's an awful lot of him in John Hume, for example, in my view. And I recognise in him absolutely straight as a die, as straight as a road can go back into O'Connell.
Yeah.
Straight as a road can go.
No violence. He said it all the time, on every
all,
occasion.
From the beginning.
Yeah.
And in that dialogue.
The cemetery here at Glasnevin is intimately connected with our memory of Daniel O'Connell. Founded by him as a cemetery for all religions and none, it represents both his final resting place and his enduring liberal legacy. What's this?
Mind the dog.
The dog?
Left and right, as you go into the O'Connell crypt, there are 2 kennels for 2 dogs. And any painting you ever saw of O'Connell,
Had
he had
dogs.
the Kerry hound or an Irish wolfhound on the lead. They were to protect the chieftain.
So the symbolism
Symbolism is there.
is there. Yeah. Goodness me. And he loved his dogs. And this is where Daniel O'Connell is buried.
Yes, under a slab of black Kilkenny limestone.
Yeah.
Same thing was used to cover all the British monarchs.
So that's the
This piece of
symbolism
stone, yes.
that this was our king.
This is our king. This is our king. O'Connell is here in an Irish oak lead-lined coffin.
So all of these dusty coffins, these are all the O'Connell
All the O'Connell family.
Goodness. And if you think of the pharaohs, they brought relations with them as well. There was a certain grandeur about O'Connell's way of living. Yeah, and dying. And just again, that in there, I can put in my hand here, right?
You can.
And touch O'Connell's coffin. Goodness me. There it is.
His dying words, my body to Ireland, my soul to heaven, and my heart to Rome. We have his body, we don't know about his soul, and the heart was last known in the Irish College in Rome, but I don't think we can find it anymore.
I always thought his heart probably was dedicated to Ireland, to be quite frank, rather than Rome. But maybe we would claim that, wouldn't we? Daniel O'Connell grew up in the majestic wildness of County Kerry. There's much debate as to where he was actually born, but O'Connell himself always believed it was here in his father, Morgan O'Connell's home at Carn, near Cahersiveen. But the infant Daniel was soon fostered out to a remote dwelling 9 miles away at Tiramoil. Daniel didn't really know his parents very well when he was a little kid. The fact that the Catholic minor gentry, like the aristocracy, would have had their kids fostered meant that he had a chance to live the ordinary life that most ordinary Irish people lived. His foster mother, who was the wife of one of Morgan O'Connell's head herdsmen, would have actually been his mother. As a little fella, he probably thought they were his mother and his father. It's the sort of place that a little kid could quite easily have wandered around in, played in the garden, went out with the sheep, you know, with his foster father. He would have learned to walk here, he would have learned to talk here, Irish, because that's what his foster parents spoke. And that was the sort of life, I suppose, that taught him how ordinary Irish citizens might react in particular situations. It led him to have a great understanding of the way they thought and the way they expressed themselves. You feel that this landscape must have had an influence on the young child. It was a world of myth-making, a natural world infused with a folklore tradition of which O'Connell, in time, would himself become a part. Reenach, you've done so much work on O'Connell in folklore. Looking at historical Irish figures, Pearse is very often presented as saint-like, godlike. But what about O'Connell? Was O'Connell presented more as a practical, real person?
In the oral tradition, he is placed on a pedestal, and I think that gives him certain almost messianic powers, if you like, that he's seen as a savior. And with this comes the ability, for example, it's said that he was able to cure people. When he was born, the mountains echoed back and forth, indicating that a great hero had just arrived. It's said as well that somebody called to the house and took Daniel on their knee, and Daniel was able to recite the alphabet, and his cleverness was being prophesied in this way or being shown in this way. And when he died, then nature was very much in tune with people's feelings. And a tree that was near the house where Daniel O'Connell was said to have been born withered when people realised that O'Connell had died. So that type of folk tradition, I think, indicates that he was almost supernatural.
And if people wanted to see him as Superman, Daniel wouldn't have minded. He wasn't modest. But Kerry also nurtured his self-belief. It was an independent-minded place, beyond the arm of English law, and more deeply connected in most ways to continental Europe. In these windswept bays, ships would come and go unseen by the British authorities. They'd bring luxuries from France and Spain and beyond. This smuggling made Daniel's shrewd uncle, who owned Derrynane, a small fortune. The young Daniel was adopted as his heir by this childless Uncle Morris, known as Hunting Cap. And Daniel and his brother went to live in his fine house at Derrynane. Catholic education had long been forbidden by the vicious penal laws. By the 1780s, however, Catholic schools were permitted in Ireland again, and the O'Connell boys went to one. But Hunting Cap, ambitious for his favoured nephews, kept to the tradition that the children of Catholic gentry should be educated abroad. After brief periods at Liège and Louvain in Belgium, they came here to Saint-Omer in northern France to the English college. Daniel in particular excelled. But the shadow of the French Revolution was never far away. It threatened them in Saint-Omer, and even more in Douai, where they moved next.
When you think about it, who in their right mind would send two youngsters to France in 1791, when all the traffic was people going the other way, fleeing the revolution and what happened after the revolution? And the post-revolutionary government was a very, very bloody one. The boys decided to make a break for it, and they took a carriage cross-country to Calais to catch the boat. And as they went through all the towns, the carriage would be surrounded by Republicans who'd shout, you know, little aristocrats, little priests at them, and soldiers would bang the carriage with the butts of their rifles. Like, this was scary stuff. And the boys put revolutionary cockades in their hats to make it look maybe as though they were in favour of the revolution. They were very glad to get to Calais and to get on that boat. On the ship were two other Irish brothers, the Shears brothers, and they boasted that they had been at the execution only a day or two earlier of King Louis XVI, the guillotining of the king. And some stories say that they produced a handkerchief soaked in blood, and they said that they had paid somebody at the execution to go and dip that in the blood of the guillotined king, like bloody stuff. And one of the passengers on the boat said, "How could you have sat and watched such an awful spectacle?" And seemingly, Shears said, from the love of the revolution. And Daniel O'Connell told his friend O'Neill Daunt that he shuddered, not only at the words from love of the revolution, not only at the words, but also at the way it was said.
Historians have speculated as to the impact of this bloody revolution on the teenage Daniel. Was it this that turned him against violence and the frenzy of the mob? And yet, this was a revolutionary time. And as he departed for London to study law, his young mind must have been awash with new and radical ideas. O'Connell's years in London formed his liberal mindset. He was swept up in the ideas of the Enlightenment, which celebrated reason, liberty, and tolerance. Away from the constraints of family or Catholic schooling, he read Thomas Paine on the right to rebel, William Godwin on personal freedom, and Mary Wollstonecraft on the rights of women. He returned to an equally radical world in Dublin. Revolution was in the air, and the United Irishmen were emerging in the open. Daniel joined the organisation briefly, but later condemned the failed 1798 rebellion as foolish. It was a heady time, but O'Connell's sights were now set firmly on his blossoming legal career. Working mainly on the Munster circuit, he developed a reputation as the Catholic defender, the counsellor as he'd become known. He was brilliant, arrogant and vain, but a gifted champion nonetheless.
Daniel's legal education happened mostly in England, but he qualified as a barrister here in Ireland. And I can imagine him maybe stopping at the threshold and looking around and saying, "This is a challenge, and by God, I like nothing better than a challenge."
His rise would be meteoric, and his earnings were massive even as a junior barrister. But because he was a Catholic, he couldn't progress to becoming a King's Counsel.
The Catholic Relief Act of 1793 allowed Catholics finally to become junior barristers, but there were still a lot of barricades to advancing in the legal profession for a Catholic, weren't there?
There were enormous barriers. With the ending of the Prohibition in 1793, you still had the problem that many Catholics didn't have the education. They didn't have the property or source of wealth that would sustain them while they became educated for the bar. In those days, you had to go to London. There was no reading for the bar in Ireland. So starting off with no connections, as O'Connell did, was an enormous obstacle.
He was a star barrister. You're a top barrister. What did you admire about him, Paul?
Firstly, he was a very good lawyer. He was very good technically. He was a wonderful speaker. He could engage with people. He had a wonderful ability to cross-examine. He understood the minds of Irish people, the people he was dealing with. He knew how to get to the truth. He could be beguiling in his cross-examination, start off with indifferent questions, simple questions, jokes, and then he would divert the person into the serious business, not above using some trickery.
What about the trickery? Tell us about the trickery.
Well, in one of the cases, there was a witness in a criminal case he was defending who said that he was at the scene of the crime and that he recognised the accused and that the accused's hat had been left at the scene of the crime. And O'Connell picked up the hat, which was an exhibit, looked at it and read out, or spoke out, I should say, the words, the letters J-A-M-E-S. And he said, "Is this the hat that you saw at the scene of the crime?" And the witness said, "Yes." "And did it contain those letters?" And the witness said, "Yes." And then O'Connell, with a great flourish, showed the hat to the jury and the bench and says, "It contains no such letters. There was nothing written in the hat. You are a perjurer."
As his star rose, Daniel became increasingly involved in politics. He needed an address which reflected his ambitions as a public man. So in 1809, he moved into Merrion Square with his wife Mary and their growing family.
Merrion Square, the finest square in Dublin, was a bastion of the Protestant ascendancy. It was Lord this and Lady that, and it was Protestant archbishops, it was the head of the legal system. The whole square was Protestant, so when O'Connell bought the lease of the house here, it was a sensation, because here was a Catholic moving into Protestant territory. And in a way, what O'Connell was saying, "Move over, lads, we're coming." O'Connell, by the first decade of the 19th century, was beginning to understand that he could be a messiah for the Catholics, and other people were beginning to understand that as well, because he had started to move from being a regular lawyer to being what was then called a cause lawyer, which was somebody who only took cases which had one particular kind of theme running through them. And for O'Connell, that was that the law was discriminatory against Catholics. And O'Connell was a very gifted trial lawyer and won all those cases, and therefore he became a kind of a champion of the Catholics.
And how do you think his neighbours felt about him moving in here?
No, I wouldn't think they would have liked it. It's kind of like the same thing happened in America, say, if African Americans moved into an area which was traditionally white. People didn't like it. But of course, that's what O'Connell wanted to do. There was a trophy house lived in by a rising Catholic who had the chutzpah, who had almost the balls to buy it.
This house in Merrion Square would in time also become a political headquarters for O'Connell's burgeoning Catholic movement.
This is where he had you waiting. The door here would be closed and you were put here.
There'd be chairs.
Chairs
maybe.
or whatever, you know, but you were made to wait. This is where he had his office, just here. You see, and here's the other interesting thing. Above was key part of the O'Connell operation. This is where the scriveners were. Because O'Connell would write the letter, and then he might want to send 300 copies of the damn thing. And the scrivener was like a human photocopier. You had to write out the same damn
Basically,
letter.
they were secretaries who wrote everything out.
Yeah, but you're trying to create a national organisation and indeed an international one.
Yeah.
Right? And you're only going to do it with two things, the power of the human voice, which O'Connell was a brilliant orator. But it's not like you can go on radio or TV, and as I say, there's not ease of communication. It has to be done either verbally or in writing. So this was the nerve centre of the thing, and O'Connell was a busy, busy guy in there writing those letters. That's what he did every morning, 4 o'clock till 8 o'clock. Imagine. Networking then had to be done face to face. You couldn't just pick up the phone to somebody. And O'Connell used this very fine room here as his public space. It's a little bit elevated, and because of that, gets you out of the noise of the street.
Yes, this is a magnificent room.
And even in deep midwinter, it's bright. What the windows do, they frame the sky. So 1/3 of the view is the actual buildings.
It's the buildings, and then you're
But the other
quite right.
2/3 is the sky. And every time you look here, it's like a little picture, and it constantly changes. This gave him a public space where you could put in a lot of people. In Dublin in the 18th century, like, big spaces are in short supply, and a lot of them were controlled by public organisations that wouldn't let O'Connell in the door. So he needed his own kind of space. And another thing he was able to do was also, and he did this very frequently, was if there was big public meetings or whatever that he wanted to address, he would often stand here on the balcony and address the crowd out in Merrion Square.
You needed money for this new sort of politics. Daniel found it through the Catholic rent. Everyone would pay at least a penny a month so that even the poorest had a sense of belonging and of getting support in return. With the rent,
O'Connell transformed the timid Catholic Association. It now had a mighty alternative treasury.
In 1775, the year that Daniel O'Connell was born, there were still some remaining penal laws against Catholics. O'Connell, for example, had to be educated abroad. If he wanted to become a barrister, he would have had to have had his career in England. And those restrictions gradually changed with various relief acts that were brought in. But even at the turn of the 19th century, Catholics, although they had the vote, although they become lawyers, they still had these restrictions. They weren't allowed to sit in Parliament. They weren't allowed to become King's Councils. They weren't allowed to become judges. If you were a Catholic, you were inferior in your own country. You weren't equal. And it was that sense of shame, that sense of humiliation that O'Connell was determined to change.
He had thought everything out, hadn't he? He'd actually sat down. I mean, he was a man of the Enlightenment. He believed in the whole Enlightenment's belief also in rational thinking.
I think you also have to bear in mind the fact that his very first public speech was in 1800 against the Act of Union. And he always talked about how that was his political textbook, that you could understand everything about him from reading that speech. And there was a consistent thread running throughout his career, and it was the fact that he believed that Irish people should be able to order their own affairs. And that was Catholics or Protestants or people of no religion.
But he almost decided that he personally would be the symbol of a risen people. I mean, the insistence on having the fine house in Merrion Square, of striding out with his head up on that march that he used to do down to the forecourts with his umbrella over his shoulder. Like, there was great swagger, wasn't there? I mean, it was almost as though he was doing a one-man PR job to make people feel better about themselves.
Yes, O'Connell believed that you could walk down any street in Ireland and you could immediately point out the Catholics, because they were the ones who wouldn't make eye contact with you. They were the ones who would shuffle, bad posture, afraid of meeting your gaze, broken down. And so what he wanted to do was raise the people up and convince them that they deserved to be free and they deserved to be equal.
And of course, what he was doing was he was wresting from the aristocracy and the rich control over politics, because they were the only ones up to then who could actually afford to be in politics. You weren't paid.
And that was the great genius of his penny a month scheme.
Yes.
It was essentially crowdsourcing in the 19th century, because what O'Connell decided was that for this movement to be successful, everyone must be involved. The rich, the poor, the middle classes. So by having a small sum of money that everyone could contribute, he made everyone part of the movement.
In February 1815, O'Connell called the all-Protestant Dublin Corporation beggarly. John de Stair, a young alderman, decided to take offence, and he challenged O'Connell to a duel. By the time the two confronted one another at Bishop's Court in County Kildare, the whole affair had assumed epic proportions. So, Brian, why Bishop's Court?
Well, Bishop's Court was just outside Dublin at the time, and that was important. It was out of sight of the authorities. It was also outside the county boundary, because O'Connell had been bound to the peace a few days before by Judge Day in Dublin, that he wouldn't provoke a duel.
So this is the spot. This is where the monument was, marking the spot.
Yes, the base of it here is all that's left at this stage.
In our time, the notion of dueling seems so mad. But just standing here and knowing that very likely this is where, from here and here, you know, they would have approached one another. And O'Connell knowing that he could die. You know, that's the thing that suddenly strikes you. That, okay, it was a matter of honour and all the rest of it, but that could have been kaput. And if he had gone, that was the end of the most powerful person in Ireland who stood on the side of Catholic emancipation and reform. Just, boom, gone. Well, here we were, 1815, an afternoon where it was starting to get dark, I gather, starting to snow.
That's right.
What happened?
Yeah, I mean, basically the duel had been set up for 3:30 in the afternoon. The Stair arrived about 4 o'clock. They started making the arrangements. The seconds for the two duelists, you know, setting them up. There's a report that O'Connell's second took O'Connell's cravat, which was white, made too good a target. Then when they were ready, I think the signal was the dropping of a handkerchief, and according to accounts, D'Astaire took a step to the left, moved forward and shot first. It hit the ground in front of O'Connell. O'Connell had fired in the meantime. D'Astaire fell. They had a doctor on the scene. They examined him and were satisfied that he wasn't seriously injured. So they went back to the city, and O'Connell later said that he had aimed low, and in fact the wound was in D'Astaire's thigh. And everyone was astonished the following day when they heard that D'Astaire had actually died.
When O'Connell discovered he'd actually killed the man, what was his reaction? I mean, I know his supporters' reaction was almost triumphalist, but what about his?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's added immeasurably, you know, to O'Connell's reputation. You know, he was now the Catholic champion. You know, he was the man to go to if you were in trouble.
But remorse?
Absolutely. At heart, he was a pacifist. He deliberately tried not to kill D'Astaire, but that's what had happened. So, you know, the tradition is that he was remorseful ever after during his lifetime.
So while the remorse may well have been genuine,
Yeah.
the politician in him would not have minded it burnishing up his reputation.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. We can assume that, I think.
Daniel O'Connell was never to fight another duel. He never quite forgave himself for D'Astaire's death, and remorse only strengthened his commitment to purely peaceful means. By 1825, Daniel O'Connell was a national figure. He saw himself not only as a defender of his people, but as a sort of Gaelic chieftain, and Derrynane, which he inherited from his uncle, fitted that image. It would remain his home until his death, and it seems to have been the place where he was happiest. This house is a house that any Irish person, I think, would feel comfortable in. It's not a big, grand house which is meant to intimidate anybody. It's the sort of house that Jane Austen, and she would have been of that period, would have called a gentleman's house. Seemingly, according to one guest who was here on a Sunday afternoon, she said it was raining outside, there were masses of children in the drawing room and they were tearing around the place playing and making an enormous noise, and there was even a musician in the corner and people playing cards, she said. It was a monster meeting in itself. So you got the sense of lots of people, lots of family, and a great sort of kindliness about the place. This was home, and it was a family place. He used to come home here regularly. I mean, he almost never missed most of August and all of September here hunting, no matter what was going on. He just loved the countryside, being out there on foot in the rain and God knows what else, absolutely relishing the open air, relishing being outside. The landscape of Kerry is epic. It demands of Kerry people that they are not upstaged by it, so they equally, I think, are naturally theatrical, larger than life. This was where he felt at home. It was the source that gave him the energy. This was Ireland to him.
But side by side with O'Connell's campaign for peaceful politics, there was also growing violence in the countryside. Vigilantes took revenge on landlords over evictions, unfair rents, unfair tithes for the upkeep of the Anglican clergy. The White Boys, as one such secret group was known, spread fear among the landed classes.
Secret societies were a feature of life in Ireland throughout this whole period. And they also garnered a lot of fear within people, especially in the gentry. The idea of people plotting against you. And the Doneraile conspiracy seemed to be the worst case scenario, a wide-reaching conspiracy to assassinate multiple landlords.
The famous Doneraile conspiracy trial in 1829 would copperfasten O'Connell's reputation as the counsellor, the protector of his people.
To the landlords, this is like Armageddon, the idea of people coming to assassinate you in your sleep or assassinate you on the open roads. So they want to make a really clear statement that this will not be accepted, and that anybody even thinking about this is going to be severely punished. One of the brothers of the accused had ridden his horse all the way down to County Kerry, 90 miles, had shown up when apparently O'Connell was having breakfast. He beseeched him to take the case, telling him that the defendants were facing hanging, that they were actually innocent, or most of them were innocent. Also paid him up front. And so for all these reasons, he decided to take the case.
So the first group had already been convicted and given the death sentence. The second group, which is when he came in and defended, what was it like? I mean, were people standing outside the courthouse? What happened when he arrived?
So he arrived in the nick of time. People apparently had heard that he was coming. There was a small crowd to greet him, but they were obviously incredibly heartened to see O'Connell just storm in and kind of put a halt to everything.
And eat his breakfast.
And he insisted on eating his breakfast. And you also wonder, like, was that some kind of psychological warfare? Was that him making sure that all eyes were upon him, that the jury saw that he had ridden in and that he was here to do justice?
Theatrics.
It's theatrics. It's part of the whole drama.
And they describe him there eating his breakfast with bits of crumbs going this way and that way, and with a full mouth interrupting on points of law.
Well, apparently O'Connell didn't have the best table manners, and he goes out of his way to mock the prosecutor, Doherty, to make fun of his accent. And so what he does is he systematically destroys the credibility of the witnesses, and he does so in a way that's really devastating, and he does so in a way that is it's entertaining as well.
So what happened? One of them was immediately let off.
So O'Connell had intervened in the second trial, and he had argued it to the extent that it was a hung jury. In doing so, he drew a whole lot of attention and public interest in the trial. So by the time the third trial happened, there was press correspondence, the galleries were packed, and the prosecution had been guilty of misconduct. And the judge pointed this out to O'Connell. And so you have a feeling that because of the stature of O'Connell, both as a political leader and as a legal mind, that the judge was doing what was right, both for the law and probably for himself as well.
Now, O'Connell swaggered in there, and he manages to stop nearly a dozen men being hanged. And yet, he wouldn't have stood for the sort of violence that the White Boys would have been involved in. Does that make sense to you?
Well, there's a tension in O'Connell. He very much advocates the rule of law. He's very much... he clearly advocates against violence and rebellion. He's constantly trying to rein in this kind of agitation that's violent and what have you. At the same time, he probably is also aware that in some ways his movement's encouraging it. And he's also probably aware that some of this agitation, this violent agitation, is produced by a fundamentally unfair society. And he is trying to change that society and make it more fair.
O'Connell promised the people a fairer society if they followed his peaceful political road. But if that peaceful way didn't deliver, was there a veiled threat that the people might turn to violence? A silent threat. Nations had been driven mad by oppression, he said. By now, he had created a deep sense in the Catholic population of the power of a mass movement. There was excitement as meetings and highly disciplined rallies were held across the country. People also came together in liberal clubs, organised in most Irish counties. These local clubs educated people about the modes and the mechanisms of parliamentary democracy. They were to be one of O'Connell's enduring legacies. Finally, in the Clare by-election of 1828, O'Connell challenged the rule that kept Catholics out of Parliament, and he resoundingly won the seat. It was an historic moment. The Prime Minister, the Anglo-Irish Duke of Wellington, knew that Catholic emancipation was now inevitable. The King still opposed it, but Wellington, to his credit, wore him down. At last, Daniel O'Connell came to take his rightful place in the inner sanctum of British parliamentary power. The halls of Westminster and the Commons' chamber had been barred to Catholics. Now, it seemed, their moment had come. However, O'Connell was elected before emancipation became law. So even though the anti-Catholic oath was abolished for the future, was he, Daniel O'Connell, going to be forced to swear it? The place was packed, the public gallery was packed. People had come from all over to see this moment, because it was a massive moment. There were a lot of English Catholics, remember, as well, and Scottish Catholics, all of whom were forbidden to sit in this house. So there was massive public interest in it and in him. O'Connell knew better than anybody how to play a dramatic moment, and there were 3 dramatic days here in May 1829. The first day he came in, he had to come up here and present his qualification papers that he had actually been elected, and then the clerk handed him the oath, the infamous oath that basically asked him to totally deny Catholicism. And he looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. And then he handed it back. And he made it clear that he wasn't going to swear it. So the speaker told him to withdraw. And he stood here for a long time, looking at the speaker in silence, milking the moment for everything he could get out of it. And then he withdrew. And then there was a debate about his eligibility, and it was decided it would go on the following Monday. Back he came the following Monday, and it was decided that he would be allowed to speak to the House from what's called the bar of the House. This was his moment, and he said to the House that he had been sent here by the voice of the people, a representative of the people, a martyred people. What is to become of me? Am I to remain the representative of Clare? Will the House not let me in? And is it not able to turn me out? What, I ask again, is to become of me? I call the attention of the House to that. What is to become of me? There was a vote later that night on his eligibility, And of course, he lost the vote. So again, it was up to him to come in the next day, if he wanted to, swear the horrible oath and take his seat. And again, the clerk presented him with the card that had the oath on it. And he looked at it again for a long time in silence, as though he'd never seen it before and didn't even know it existed. And then he said something to the effect that something in here was just wrong in fact, and something else in here he couldn't believe in. So he then turned around and he took the card that had the oath on it and he threw it contemptuously on the table. And the description at the time is that the house was agog, that anybody could have dared to do this. And then he withdrew again to cheers. So he came here to the Mother of Parliaments and he embarrassed the government because the legislation had been passed and this was a final piece of meanness, not to let him in, to make him go back and fight the election again under the new law.
The following summer, O'Connell was re-elected unopposed for Clare and was finally able to take his proper place in the Commons. For the next almost 20 years, he would be a towering political presence both inside and outside the chamber. The councillor had now fully become the liberator.
Mr. O'Connell is a man of the highest order of genius. There is not a member of the House who in this respect can for a moment be put in comparison with him. You see the greatness of his genius in almost every word he utters. There are others who have more tact and greater dexterity in debate, but in point of genius, none approach to him. I love this book. It was given to me as a wedding present by a friend who himself is a parliamentarian, and it is a book of random recollections of the Houses of Parliament written by a sketch writer of the time, and it meant something to me because I was a parliamentary sketch writer myself. I have seen the tear literally glistening in the eyes of men altogether unused to the melting mood. And in a moment afterwards, by a transition from the grave to the humorous, I've seen a whole audience convulsed with laughter. His mastery over the passions is the most perfect I ever witnessed. He can touch, and touch with inimitable effect, every chord in the human breast.
Catholic emancipation had been achieved, repeal of the Union and self-government were in his sights. But for now, as King George IV put it bitterly, Daniel O'Connell was King of Ireland.
You can catch the second part of this documentary at the same time next week. That's Thursday at 9:35. Eddie Redmayne stars as Stephen Hawking, telling the tale of the physicist's life from student days, finding love, motor neurons diagnosis, defying the odds, and success far beyond what was ever imagined in The Theory of Everything, Sunday at 9 over on 2. But stay with us now here on RT1 as the story of rugby explores the impact of war on the sport, how it became a large part of some countries' DNA, and how apartheid was part of the South African rugby story, defining allies and rivalries. After the break.
By 1830, Daniel O'Connell, the uncrowned King of Ireland, was finally a member of the British Parliament, the first Irish Catholic ever so elected. He had helped achieve parliamentary representation for Catholics, but his eyes were now set upon a far greater challenge: to repeal the Act of Union that had taken away Ireland's political autonomy.
In London, O'Connell vigorously pursued his liberal ideals through Parliament. But at home in Ireland, an undercurrent of violent insurrection would continue to present a challenge to his peaceful vision. These two opposing traditions would define the very nature of Irish politics for decades. What draws me to Daniel O'Connell is that he lets me into the picture. I mean, if you look at history and you look at mythology, there were always male protagonists because that's how it was. Might is right. But once you take physical force out of the equation, as O'Connell did in his politics, well then what you're talking about is the strength of the art of persuasion. And women can do that as well as men. In fact, many people would say better than men. So he allowed women to be part of what was going on. They helped to gather the Catholic rent. They came to his meetings. Suddenly, by opening the door to popular politics, he also opened the door to women. This is royal Tara, where the old kings of Ireland were anointed. This is where St. Patrick spoke to the kings of Ireland and supposedly converted them. And Daniel was big into symbolism. You know, he was referred to as the uncrowned king of Ireland. So this place was extraordinarily important. It was a holy day, the 15th of August. 100,000 to 1 million people were here. It was a very big meeting. There were 40 makeshift churches built, and people remembered the low voices of the priests and the little tinkle of the bells for communion. There were over 40 temperance bands. Remember, the big thing O'Connell said, we will have sobriety and discipline at all the meetings. And O'Connell on that day was particularly critical of the Union and how Ireland needed to get its own parliament back. And all these monster meetings had a purpose. Number one, to bring people together and make them feel involved, but also to show that he, O'Connell, could bring enormous crowds together and he could control them. But behind that was the threat that if these people didn't get what they wanted and didn't get the progress they needed, could he continue to control them? So there was probably always that subliminal threat underneath these meetings. And, you know, the government took notice. I mean, at a meeting very soon after at Mullaghmast, he was presented with a velvet hat which was on the model of the old Irish crown with a bit of gold on it. And he put it on and he wore it almost ever after. And the government spy who was there said it was like a coronation. The government was watching these meetings very carefully, and the sort of messages that O'Connell wanted to send out were being sent out. Give us what we're asking for, or I can't really be responsible for what happens.
Well, after the 1798 rebellion, the British government decided to abolish the Irish Parliament and rule directly from London. So 100 Irish MPs were elected, and until emancipation, they were all Protestant. And his first public speech was denouncing that measure, and he believed that the Irish Catholics should oppose it. So repeal was something that he was involved with, not just after emancipation, but throughout his life, in the 1800s, in the 1810s, in the 1820s, in the 1830s, and all the way up to his death in 1847. And what he wanted wanted to do was repeal the Act of Union of 1800, restore the Irish Parliament, and rule as part of, well, the British Empire, but rule with your own Parliament in Dublin.
What were his flaws?
Well, he had a lot of flaws. He had a huge ego, and his vanity was legendary. When he would travel around the country in the 1830s, he would ask school children if they knew who he was, and if they didn't, he'd say, "I'm the person who won you your freedom." When journalists would ask him who was the greatest person in Irish history, he would say, "Myself." He wanted people to think he was the great chieftain, living in the great house with the great carriage, with the great estate down in Kerry. He couldn't afford these things at the time because he was just so bad with money.
The Irish liberator was now becoming a huge public figure in England. Nick Robinson, himself a former cartoonist, showed us in his cartoon collection how O'Connell's enemies focused on the Catholic rent which funded his politics. They lampooned O'Connell as a money-grabbing lawyer and opportunist.
O'Connell suddenly bursts on the scene by winning the Clare by-election in 1828. He is usually dressed up in a barrister's wig and gown. The audience was a London politically aware crowd. And in order to be in the Prince, you had to have really got up their nose in some way or another. Daniel is usually riding an ass because he and Richard Shiel, who tends to ride a cat ass is short for Catholic Association.
Which was their political organisation.
The way the cartoonists mocked that.
Now, we're really into cat ass here.
That's right. They're chasing the unrealistic dreams of Catholic emancipation.
Will-o'-the-wisp.
But it's Daniel who gets the rent.
And the rent. They always have the rent in there, don't they? They never miss an opportunity.
But these cartoons also show the power of O'Connell's presence on the political landscape of the time. At Westminster in the 1830s, he was tireless. He backed the Liberal government's reforms of the franchise and of local government. But his biggest job was ensuring that bigotry would not stop Catholic emancipation being implemented on the ground. He was a true liberal. He believed in the rights of women. He declared, "Mind has no sex." And his sort of politics, he said, relied entirely on reason and persuasion common to both sexes. Most of all, he fought against slavery, because for Daniel, the cause of the oppressed Catholics of Ireland was the cause of the oppressed anywhere.
When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard she could not stand, let my people go. Go down, Moses. My dad loved Paul Robeson. He used to sing a lot of the Negro spirituals that Paul Robeson sang. I remember Paul Robeson's picture, Paul Robeson records, and my father had a similar deep voice. But the other thing, of course, that Robeson was one of the most prominent activists for black rights in America. He was something else. His father was an escaped slave. So it was that near the experience. So as children down in Borris, County Carlow, which isn't the centre of the world, except if you live there, when we began to see Martin Luther King and the civil rights marches on television, we knew where this was coming from because of my father's admiration for this wonderful singer. if you read Robeson's biography, his big hero that he quotes all the time is Frederick Douglass, the black activist who came to Ireland and England in, the 1840s. And who did he want to meet? He wanted to meet Daniel O'Connell because O'Connell was probably the best known abolitionist voice at that stage in the British Isles, if not in Europe. And it was that same uncompromising stance that Robeson took, that Frederick Douglass took, that Daniel O'Connell took.
The young Frederick Douglass was hugely impressed by the Liberator. He admired his organisational abilities and his thrilling orator's voice. In a letter, he records his affection for O'Connell.
I cannot proceed without alluding to a man who did much to abolish slavery in the British Empire. I mean Daniel O'Connell. I feel grateful to him, for his voice has made American slavery shake to its centre. I am determined, wherever I go and whatever position I may fill, to speak with grateful emotions of Mr. O'Connell's labours. I heard his denunciation of slavery. I heard my master curse him, and therefore I loved him.
It's an interesting connection, isn't it? Douglass meeting O'Connell, who was at the end of his life.
Yeah.
And the American Civil War, which was about slavery as well as other things, was not to happen for 13 years.
Yeah.
It just shows you, I suppose, how advanced O'Connell's thinking was.
Remarkable. O'Connell was 70 years of age at that stage. Douglass, I think, was 27. And O'Connell was seen and regarded as a major international figure. He was a wonderful orator. And Douglass was hugely impressed. But this was a consistent thread of O'Connell's life and politics. He was a passionate opponent of slavery.
And the interesting thing about it, of course, was he also needed to collect money for his political campaigns. And there would have been quite a source of money from Irish America, who admired him for what he was doing. But he was careful about the people he took money from, wasn't he?
He was very clear. I mean, there's some documentation from 1843 where he's at the height of his money-raising activity because he's having many, many monster meetings that year. But he makes it very clear that he will not accept money from certain people in America, people who would be supportive of the institution of slavery.
When she died, he was broken-hearted. They were in love. Mary was a poor relation, but he married her anyway, defying his furious uncle at Derrynane. They went on to have 7 children. There are few enough of Daniel's letters that aren't about business and about politics, except for the letters that he writes to Mary. And in the letters, a terrific warmth shows through. He relied on her for political advice and for moral advice. And that comes through in every line of the letters. And he missed her very much when he was away. Now, I might also go on to say that doesn't mean that he was necessarily the most faithful husband. We don't have chapter and verse evidence that indeed he was constantly womanizing. But there was a period after Mary stopped having children where he spent an awful lot of time away from Mary. As Erin Bishop points out in her book about Mary O'Connell, he wasn't around as far as Mary was concerned, and you do wonder what happened at that time. That still doesn't undermine the fact that their relationship was a very, very warm one, and that when she died, he was broken-hearted. It was a time of grief and of huge financial stress. Yes, the election in 1835 had brought success, and in London his new crop of Irish MPs allowed him to hold the balance of power with the Liberals. But elections cost money. He was in debt. He was lonely. Excluded as an Irish Catholic from so many London clubs, O'Connell helped to found his own.
This is the founding resolution of the club.
And there is Daniel O'Connell, Esquire, MP, at the first meeting, February 8th, 1836.
The welcome for O'Connell in London cooled as he moved into the 1840s. The liberal Protestant support he'd had for emancipation was not there for repeal of the Union. Most hostile of all were Northern Irish Orangemen. On a fraught visit to Belfast, they ran him out of town. But even within his own repeal movement, there were problems as hardliners pushed for a more aggressive approach. Surrounded by critics, Daniel had started to doubt himself. Looking at these new forces on the rise, maybe for the first time, he wasn't sure he could control them. Daniel O'Connell was becoming the old lion at bay by the 1840s. His campaign to repeal the Act of Union was seen by the Tory government as a threat to the unity of the empire. On the other hand, in his own movement, he was seen as much too moderate. The Young Irelanders were ready to consider confrontation, sabotage, violent means. They saw Daniel and his peaceful parliamentary tradition as old hat. Every family has its history, and mine is no different. My gentle grandfather O'Leary was a cultural nationalist, a lover of the Irish language and of archaeology, while my maternal grandfather Dundon, imprisoned in British jails, had a more dramatic and arguably a more glamorous story. My mother's father, he ran guns and dynamite from, God, it's shocking even to hear myself say that, from Scotland, brought it over to Larne and down. And in his own written account of what he did, which I think was only done in order to apply for a military pension, he never talked about what he did in the war to his children. He said that the gelignite that they brought over was used during 1916 in the GPO. It often struck me, and maybe really in recent years, and having covered Northern Ireland for all that time, that pride, I suppose, that I had in my grandfather is beginning to give way to a feeling that really the problem with violence is that violence begets violence, and that 1916 and what happened after it was used by the Provisional IRA in Northern Ireland as a justification for their campaign and for what they did. We said, we're just continuing what happened back there. And it struck me that there's a big danger in glorifying violence and violent rebellion. And I found myself, Michael Collins was a big hero in our house. I'd read about 4 or 5 biographies of him by the time I was 18 or 19. But I found myself recently, putting that aside. The picture of Collins has actually been sold. And I'm much more conscious of that peaceful parliamentary tradition that my gentle old grandfather O'Leary stood for. And that is a tradition inherited from O'Connell through Parnell. And it's a part of our history and our inheritance that we don't hear enough about. I heard very little about that parliamentary tradition when I was a kid at school. And I heard little about John Redmond, who got home rule on the statute book. that whole story of our parliamentary tradition got sidelined. I just wonder whether his non-violent approach is such a reproach to the story of the armed rebellion on which the narrative of the foundation of this state is bound, that he sort of got pushed onto the top shelf and was allowed to get a bit dusty up there.
Yes, yes. Well, I think that's probably right, because what happened was the story became, like as we say in our proclamation, all of the times we went into these revolutions, you know, in the past 300 years or whatever. But actually that is not the story of the Irish people. The greatest story the Irish people have to tell is how they were a people excluded totally from power, and how they, in a colonial context, achieved and changed that through democratic means. So, I mean, that was, I think, his great achievement. That's why I say he's the founding father of Irish democracy. He laid the modes and methods and the values in the people as to how you achieve and enlist public opinion and make change.
Dublin Castle's British authorities cracked down after vast crowds had attended monster meetings across the country. They outlawed the next meeting planned for Clontarf. Robert Peel's London government were closing in on the Liberator. O'Connell was increasingly a marked man. With artillery and gunships already assembled, Daniel O'Connell feared mass slaughter, and he called off the meeting at Clontarf. The cancellation widened the split in the Repeal Association. Many were to accuse him of bottling it.
Many historians will ask the question, if Daniel O'Connell had been more resolute, if that mass popular movement had been taken that step further, would that have changed the course of 19th century Irish history in a different way that might have saved far more lives than the people who could have potentially been hurt at Clontarf?
That's a bit far-fetched, actually, Owen, because, I mean, you're talking about a man who consistently, all of his life, said that he believed in political progress by peaceful means.
I'm not convinced, and nobody will know, whether or not if he took the decision to proceed with a perfectly peaceful monster meeting at Clontarf, that the outcome in terms of positive benefits for Irish political emancipation couldn't have been advanced. When you're in a struggle to change society and improve the quality of people's lives, there are times you have to stand firm, and when you do, well, you take a risk.
With other people's lives.
With your own life, as much as anybody else's.
It's grand to take a risk with your own life,
Martin Luther King marched at the front of those marches. John Hume marched at the front of those marches. They were high-risk decisions.
John Hume decided not to go on the Bloody Sunday march because he said, I knew that the paratroopers were trigger-happy and I did not want people to be shot, and I begged the organisers not to go ahead, he said to me in an interview, but they didn't listen to me, and I had the most dreadful feeling that this would happen, because John Hume and O'Connell had that similar attitude.
Olivia,
you don't play with other people's lives.
Let's be very careful. Let's not blame the organisers or the participants in Bloody Sunday for the actions of British Parachute Regiment. I'm not arguing to sacrifice anybody, but when you are trying to change society, when you are peacefully confronting a power which is oppressing and discriminating and excluding thousands and tens of thousands of people, I think at those crucial turning points, there is a challenge, and my honest view, and this isn't anything to do reflecting my view of contemporary society or politics, my honest view is that if they had stood firm at Clontarf, I think the eventual outcome of that would have been much more positive for Irish society. But again, neither of us will ever know.
I've often wondered where Ireland's loudest voice in Westminster was when the Great Famine struck Ireland. Well, in 1846, he spoke 3 times in the House on the famine. The illness which was to kill him had already set in. but he bombarded the government with letters begging for aid. He asked for the setting up of public works so that hungry people could work and get paid. But Lord John Russell's Liberals had adopted the new economic gospel of non-interference. Ideology can turn the heart to stone. In January 1847, old and dying, he went to the House of Commons to make a final plea. He was a shadow of the man that this house knew. He was a broken man. And he was so weak that his two sons, both of them MPs, were holding him up. So this man, who all his life had been a very proud man, who had never really let anybody put him down, who had taken on this whole house and its laws at a certain time, suddenly this man had to be a beggar, to do the sort of thing that he told Irish people not to do, you know? Don't bow the knee. You're a proud people, stand up proud. But he knew that all he could do was beg. And the descriptions of the time say that he held his hands out like this, like a beggar man. And he made this speech. He said, "Ireland is in your hands." I found this so moving. It's extraordinary. When you read these words and you know what he was talking about at home. "Ireland is in your hands, in your power. If you do not save her, she cannot save herself. I solemnly call on you to recollect that I predict with the sincerest conviction that 1/4 of her population will perish unless you come to her relief." So he asked what he called a great national act of charity. He asked for a great national act of charity to save the country. He didn't get it. The cold destructiveness of the famine was matched only by authorities who allowed exports of Irish food while the poor starved. For Daniel O'Connell, it must have felt like the ultimate defeat of his life's work, his campaign to raise a people's spirit. The famine haunted his dying days.
The big issue was how to get cheap food to the people. And the works weren't doing this. It was already fairly clear by early 1847 that the public works were not working, that people were dying on the works, that the pay was inadequate, that the work people were doing was useless, that the public works were spreading infectious disease. So that in the context of the Great Famine, public works were, I think, an impractical scheme. Now, O'Connell did say that it would be better to simply feed the people and give them the money, as it were, directly to buy the food. And that is true.
And I mean, he suggested that there should be £40 million raised for, I mean, he knew the scale of it, didn't he?
Yes. But O'Connell might mention big numbers, and there was no way that the government were going to honour or accept that kind of suggestion. I think economists and economic historians looking at Daniel O'Connell would have a different, slightly, I won't say jaundiced, but, you know, a slightly less idealised view of O'Connell than people who look at him in the context of his views on civil liberties, civil rights, slavery, and in all those respects, O'Connell is brilliant, you know, and very progressive. But in terms of an economic programme, I don't really see an economic programme that would benefit the poor. I don't see very much.
As O'Connell's powers declined and the horrors of the famine took hold, mass graves and coffin ships became familiar sights. A stricken people grew angry and bitter. The political landscape was rife with unrest. The government's callous neglect had dealt a massive blow to O'Connell's long struggle for peaceful progress in Ireland.
It was an extraordinarily sad journey, and anybody who saw him on that trip, who saw this shrunken, emaciated, gloomy figure, couldn't recognize it as the great liberator who had thrilled the world with his voice. He was frightened of death. Death was coming. He would hardly let his chaplain, Father Miley, out of his sight the whole time. He was having nightmares. He was having night horrors. And towards the end, he thought he was in the House of Commons again, and he was hurling abuse at Robert Peel, his old enemy. And he was saying, "I have repeal. Hurrah, I have it here in a box." Maybe saddest of all, he was afraid that he was going to be buried alive, and he kept begging his manservant, John Duggan, to make sure he wouldn't be buried alive.
Despite O'Connell's weakened state, he was celebrated as he made his pilgrimage through France. To excited radical Catholics, O'Connell represented not a church supporting repressive monarchies, but a Catholicism allied to liberty.
In terms of liberal Catholics in France, why was O'Connell important to them?
They wanted to reconcile God and liberty. So what they saw in Ireland was the future, in fact, or the present of Irish Catholicism. The present of Irish politics was kind of the future, it prefigured the future of what they wanted like in France.
So it was linking Catholicism and democracy.
I would say more precisely Catholicism and liberty, freedom, liberty, modernity.
Yeah.
And you know, the last time he went to France, in his way to Rome, he spent 3 days in Paris. And he was ill, he was tired, exhausted, etc. But he was visited by many personalities in his room in the hotel, the Archbishop of Paris, and the president of the Catholic Party was Montalembert. And what he said to O'Connell at that moment is very interesting, and maybe I can find it. He said, "We are all your children, or rather your students. You are our master, our model, our glorious professor. You are not only the man of a nation, you are the man of the world Christianity. Your glory is not only Irish." You know, O'Connell answered. It was difficult for him, but he said, "Gentlemen, illness and emotion are closing my mouth. I consider this moment as one of the most significant in my life." So.
Yeah. So that final homage mattered. Yeah, and I think people turned out as he was going down through France too.
Yeah.
To see.
In the newspapers, you can find reports of O'Connell was in Orléans, then in Lyon, then in Marseille, and a lot of people, crowds were acclaiming him.
Yeah. When he was probably too sick even to be aware of it.
Yeah, at the end, yeah.
After he married particularly, he would have become much more of an Orthodox Catholic in terms of, you know, attending Mass and all that sort of thing, because his wife was a very Orthodox Catholic. But still, for most of his life, he maintained his independence. He always said, "I would as soon take my politics from Constantinople as from Rome." He made it clear, he said, "I'm a Catholic, I'm not a papist, so I'm not the Pope's man." Now, it may have been at the very end of his life, afraid of death, fearful when he was clinging to his chaplain, that he would have become very much more the obedient servant of the church. But for most of his life, he made it very clear that he believed in the separation of church and state, that he believed in a pluralist Ireland, that he believed in reconciliation between orange and green. So, I think the evidence is there that he was a man of independent mind. While being a Catholic, he was a man of independent mind. O'Connell left Paris behind and travelled slowly southwards towards Rome, his feverish body weakening and his mind distressed. Why didn't O'Connell's heart go to St. Peter's in Rome? It may be that the Vatican guessed that Britain mightn't approve of such a signal honour to someone who'd often been a thorn in its side. And the Vatican still needed British cooperation to restore remaining rights to English Catholics. So it was to the Irish College that O'Connell's heart went. The future powerful Cardinal Paul Cullen was in charge there, and it was to Cullen that O'Connell's upset chaplain, Father Miley, wrote.
And then it's coming the letter which announced the death of Daniel O'Connell.
Dear Dr. Cullen, O'Connell is dead. He expired last night at 9:30. He received the last rites.
What is interesting in the top corner here.
Yes, he's added an addendum up here.
In the end, it's about O'Connell will that his heart has to stay in Rome, you know.
He now sends his heart to the feet of St. Peter. This evening, the heart is to be taken out, embalmed, and placed in a silver urn. Again, it's an upset letter, and Miley, we know, wondered whether the Pope would agree to O'Connell being brought into St. Peter's and the heart perhaps being there. But he obviously feels failing that, St. Agatha's Church, which of course was attached to the Irish College, would perhaps have been where to go. When I was reading that letter from Father Miley, it was so stark, you know, the first line, O'Connell is dead. And you were suddenly conscious of what that would have meant in an Ireland which was devastated by the famine, where O'Connell's tradition had now been challenged by a newer tradition which believed in the use of violence. I mean, Ireland was in such turbulence and in such a state, and suddenly to read those words, O'Connell is dead, you suddenly had some idea of the enormity of that. This figure that Ireland had looked up to for so very long, this stalwart figure, was gone, and at a time perhaps when the country needed him most.
In the long years after O'Connell's death in Genoa and the memorial service here in Rome, it's always seemed to me that the Catholic Church gradually took over his legacy. In time, the Catholic emancipator was mythologized as a sainted Catholic hero rather than the robust liberal champion that he actually was. But at the time of his death, it was the liberal O'Connell who was celebrated. His reputation was immense. His funeral, here at San Andrea della Valle, was a magnificent celebration of his life. His heart, in its silver urn, lay on a catafalque. Over 2 days, thousands flocked to see it, and to hear the great radical preacher Ventura deliver the eulogy. He pointed to O'Connell's belief in the separation of church and state, showed how O'Connell had aligned Catholicism and liberty. Ventura was true to O'Connell's liberal spirit.
He died thinking of himself as a desperate failure. That always bothers me. Actually, I get very, very upset to think of him dying in the belief that he was a failure. Of course, he dies in the middle of the famine. I can only imagine the grief, of a man who was so wedded to his country's well-being and his people's well-being. But I think that his legacy to us came into its own. You see, like so many good people with great ideas and great vision, he knew perfectly well that the things that he believed in and the things that he could see ahead probably wouldn't happen in his lifetime, but he planted the seed anyway.
In the Irish College of today, there's an elegant Benzoni sculpture dedicated to Daniel O'Connell. It proclaims that his heart lies within. But it doesn't. For when the monument was moved here in the 1920s from the college's former location in the centre of Rome, the heart of the liberator had mysteriously disappeared. I visited the old Irish College at St. Agatha's with Father Fergus O'Farrell to see where the sculpture had originally stood, with O'Connell's heart supposedly in the wall behind it.
So let's just go and look where it actually was.
The monument was here, in this spot here.
Yes.
And it took up the whole of that, really. So when the Irish College moved, then they took away the monument from the wall.
So that was here. Now, where was the heart?
Well, the heart, the idea was that the heart would go behind the monument, and they had kind of a receptacle for it. So the idea was that the heart would go into that.
Yes.
And, but when they took the monument away from the wall, there was nothing in that.
They were moving from
when
here
they were moving
to
from here to
premises
the Irish College.
In 1927?
1927, yeah. 27, 28, they moved the monument.
Yeah. Now, what do you think? I mean, what's your own view of where the heart is?
Well, I think it's still here. It's under the, it's in the crypt, I think. Yeah. Well, I think what happened was probably that the urn didn't fit behind the monument. When they were putting up the monument, that the urn didn't fit. That's what I really think happened.
Yes.
And because if you go through the newspapers or the archives, you see lots of references to kind of the monument being prepared and being ready. Yeah. And but you find no reference to the monument being actually erected or the ceremony of putting the heart behind it or anything like that. And I think just maybe that there was a bit of embarrassment about the fact that it didn't fit behind the monument and that they put it down, buried it in the crypt.
I admire Fergus's hope that the heart remains somehow buried here within the bowels of St. Agatha's. The more hard-nosed consensus is that the silver urn was stolen and the liberator's embalmed heart callously thrown away, into the Tiber perhaps, or even thrown to dogs. But I wondered too why the Church or the Irish state has never established the truth. It seems at best careless, at worst disrespectful to O'Connell's memory. When the ship carrying O'Connell's body reached the Dublin docks, a departing coffin ship passed it, and the passengers raised a great cry. Ireland was a sad place in August 1847, as thousands of people lined the streets of Dublin for his funeral to Glasnevin Cemetery. Today, Derrynane House is a superb national monument, and every summer people gather to honour and re-examine Daniel O'Connell's legacy. The famous chariot on which he was proudly paraded through the streets of Dublin, now immaculately restored, seems almost too magnificent for its humble confines.
When Derrynane opened as this National Heritage Centre in 1967, De Valera's president spoke, and he was very honest in his speech. He said that he and his generation had hated O'Connell, but they had been wrong, because they would never have been able to achieve what they achieved if O'Connell had not led his movement in the 19th century. And De Valera admitted that it was O'Connell, by raising the Catholics from their knees, by convincing them that they were more than slaves, that had made the great triumph of independence possible.
De Valera went further, talking privately later to Office of Public Works architect Austin Dunphy. How, he said, could we promote the memory of the man who achieved so much by parliamentary means with no loss of life? To praise him would have made it impossible for us to justify armed insurrection. Daniel O'Connell's lasting legacy is a democratic politics with no blood on its hands. It's an honourable legacy, a profoundly moral message, which Eamon de Valera himself admitted had not been acknowledged. For far too long, we decided not to listen to it. Perhaps we're listening now.
Up next, it's Sport Meets Politics, as the story of rugby documents how fascist nations tried to stomp out their support, while long-term rivals of the English, the French, embraced the game like no other, and one of their aristocrats was the driving force to its introduction in the Olympic Games. That's the story of rugby after the break.